So we're from Group 3 and we're going to talk about perception and individual decision making. And there is me, Lofi, Daryl, and then Warham, Ahmad Adiat, and Mario, or Marley. Okay, next slide, please. So, what is perception? Well, perception is the way we organize and interpret sensory impressions in order to give meaning to our environment. So, as you may already know, people's behavior is based on their perception of what reality is, not on reality itself. So, the term of the world as it is perceived is the world that is behaviorally important. So, it means that our perception becomes the reality from which we act. And now we're going to talk about factors that influence perception. Next slide, please. Okay, the first one is the factors that reside on the perceiver, and the second one on the situation, and then the third one is from the target. The first one from the perceiver. So when you look at a target, your interpretation of what you see is influenced by your personal characteristics, such as attitudes, motives, interests, experience, and expectations. So in some ways, we can say that we just see what we want to see and we just hear what we want to hear. So it's not because of it's the truth, but sometimes because it just confirms our thinking. And then the third one is target. So the factors that reside in the target is novelty, motion, sounds, size, background, proximity, and similarity. So the characteristics of the targets also affect what we perceive. So we don't look at targets in isolation. The relationship of a target to its background influence perception, as does our tendency to group things and similar things together. So as when, for example, is when people have criminal records, they usually being prejudiced or prejudged by the workplace, even when it's known that they were just wrongly arrested. But sometimes, differences can work in our favor, those such as when we are drawn to targets that are different from what we expect. So the third one is situation. So the factors that reside in situation is time, work setting, and social setting. So you can also call it as the context. Yeah. So context is also matters. So like time, and then the place, the work, the work setting, and then the social setting, like this situational factors. So it can influence our attention. And people are usually not aware of the factors that influence their view of reality. So, in fact, people are not even that perceptive about their own abilities. So, yeah, awareness and objective measures. Uh, these are the two things that can reduce our perception distortions. So now you move to the next slide, please. Now we're talking about person perception, making judgment about the others. So there's this theory called attribution theory, but before that, I'm gonna explain something to you. So many of our perceptions of others are formed by first impressions and small cues that have little supporting evidence. So even the research indicates that we form our strongest impressions based on what we perceive about another's moral character. But our initial information about this can be sketchy and unfounded. So yeah, that means that human tendencies can interfere with person perception. Now we're talking about attribution theory. So what is attribution theory? It is an attempt to determine whether an individual's behavior is internally or externally caused. So yeah, attribution theory suggests that when we observe an individual's behavior, we attempt to determine whether it was internally or externally caused. It depends on these three factors. The first one is distinctiveness, the second one is consensus, and then the third one is consistency. So, but I'm gonna explain it to you first about what does it mean with internally caused uh, behaviors and what does it mean with externally caused behaviors. So, internally caused behaviors are, those observer that believe that, you know, to be under the personal behavior control of another individual. So, someone acting in this way or that way under their control. But when for the externally caused behavior is it is what we imagine that the situation is forced the individual to do. And then now I'm gonna talk about uh, those three things. I mean distinctiveness and then consensus and consistency. So distinctiveness it refers to whether an individual displays different behaviors in different situations. So what we want to know is whether this behavior is unusual. If it is, so we're likely to give it an external attribution, and if it's not, we will probably just uh, judge the behavior to be internal. And then consensus. Consensus is this thing happen if everyone who faces a similar situation responds in the same way. So in here, if consensus is high, you will probably give an external attribution. And then for the consistency, it is when someone acts the same way in a given situation each time it occurs. So as you can see that there's this graphics, yeah. So the first thing that we do, in perception, of course, we just observe. So the first one is so observation, and then after we observe like people's behaviors and others, uh, we will interpret it, and then after that we can just conclude it to this attribution of cause, so we can actually determine whether this individual is influenced by these three vectors, whether it's distinctiveness, consensus, and consistency. So for the distinctiveness, it's usually the external cost is higher than the internal cost, and for the consensus, it's usually that the external cost is higher than the internal cost. But then for the consistency, it's usually the external cost is higher than the internal cost. And then I'm going to explain to you about errors. Can you move to the next slide, please? Okay. Now there are these errors or biases distorts attribution, which is not good if it happens. Well, the first thing that you have to know is there's this term is called fundamental attribution error. So it is the tendency of people to underestimate the influence of external factors and overestimate the influence of internal factors when making judgment about the behavior of others. And then, individuals and organizations they tend to attribute their own successes to internal factors such as ability or effort. This is sometimes may lead to the self-serving bias. So, self-serving bias is the tendency of an individual to attribute their own successes to internal factors and put the blame for their failures on external factors. So, what we can get from attribution theory is that the concept of attribution theory they significantly advance our understanding of people perception by helping us to identify why we draw certain conclusions from people's behaviors. Thank you.
Okay, after we know how we perceive people or what have been explained by Lofi about people perception, there are some common shortcuts in judging others. There are four types of judge shortcuts, and the first one is selective perception, when there is a tendency to selectively interpret what one sees on the basis of one interest, background, experience, and attitude. And the second one is halo effect. It is the tendency to draw a general impression about an individual on the basis of a single characteristic. And next slide, please. Okay, then we have contrast effect. We evaluate of a person characteristic that is affected by comparison with other people recently encountered who rank higher or lower on the same characteristic. And the last one is stereotyping, is when we judge someone on the basis of one perception of the group to which that person belongs to. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so after we know the four kind of shortcuts on uh, in judging others, there are this specific application of shortcut in organization, which are employment interview, and performance expectation, and the last one is performance evaluation. These three examples can use any judging shortcuts, or maybe like when we want to employ someone, we could have a judgment from stereotyping, or maybe because the interviewers have all had interview someone else, they maybe compare it to others, then they use contrast effect. So uh, the four shortcuts can be used anywhere from the three examples. Okay, next slide, please.
Yes, now we move on to the link between perception and decision making. First, I'm gonna explain what is decision making. Decision is a choice that is made. So there are several choices, as you can see here, and a decision is one of those choices that you picked. Now, after you picked a decision, sometimes problems may occur. Now, what is a problem? A problem is something that occurs between the current state of affair and the desired state of affair. So here it is. Now, one man's problem may be another man's state of desired state. Like, for example, this one, there's an increase in marketing department's budget for this year. For the general manager, this may be seen as a problem because the increase in budget will increase expense and decrease the overall income. But for the marketing management, this means that perhaps they have a project that they haven't been able to do because it was lacking budget. Now they can. As you can see, one man's problem may be another's desired state. And then, how do we make a good decision? Well, how do we make a rational decision? Well, from the book, there's this rational decision making model, which consists of 6 steps. First, we define the problem. What is the problem? Maybe perhaps we lack budget. Second, we identify the criteria. How much budget is it? Maybe $5 million, $10 million. And then we allocate weights to the criteria. And then maybe creating one decision is not enough. Therefore, we must make other options. We develop alternatives, we evaluate those alternatives, and then we select the best one. Moving on, while making decisions, decisions can be affected by biases, as you all know. The first one, anchoring bias, is we are fixated on initial informations. The cause of this is because there's no other informations, or we simply fail to adjust to new informations. The second one is confirmation bias. It's the tendency to seek out new informations that confirms our prior decision. we are stuck to that one decision, even though it's wrong. But yet we still seek out information that confirms it. The next one is availability bias. It's the tendency to for people to base their judgment on information that is readily available around them and only available to them, meaning that their perspective is not that broad. They need to broaden up their perspective. And then the next one is escalation of commitment. Instead of changing your decision, you kept increasing your commitment on that decision in spite of information that proves it wrong. And the next one is randomness error. It's the tendency is for individuals to believe that a truly random event has something caused that truly random events. For example, if you run a random number generator from 1 to 10, the result is 6. Now, randomness error is when you believe that there are factors that affects the random number generator and makes the result into 6, even though it is truly random. The next one is risk aversion. This one is basically you are blinded by safetyness. Instead of looking for the most gain, you look for the most safe outcome, which is, well, might be correct. However, it may not be the correct decision when you are looking for the most gain. The hindsight bias, it's the tendency to believe falsely after an outcome of an event is actually known that one would have accurately predicted the outcome. We're moving on to reducing biases after we know the problem. Let's find out how to reduce it. First off, we must focus on the goal. Second, we need to do more research. This one is to counteract the risk bias. So in order to get the most gain, we definitely need to take the most risky decision. And of course, there's a problem. So we need to reduce the risk. How? We need to do more research. Now, the third one is directly to counteract the randomness error. That is, don't try to make meaning out of random events. Just don't. And the fourth, if sometimes you make a wrong decisions because that's your only options. Therefore, before it is too late, increase your options. So you are not forced to choose that one option that is wrong.
So moving on to the next part, I will be explaining about influences on decision making, which involve individual differences and organizational constraints. Next slide, please. So in the first part of individual differences, it is involves the personality. Personality involves consciousness and self-esteem. Research suggests personality influences our decision. And then we can see that in the consciousness part, achievement-oriented people hate to fail. And then in the self-esteem or general self-perception of being good enough is rather stable trait. And then we have gender. We can see gender in decision making. That stressful situation, it appears that men become more egocentric and make more risky decisions. In the mental ability, we can see people with higher levels of mental ability are able to process information more quickly, solve problems more accurately, and learn faster. And in the cultural differences, the rational model makes no acknowledgement of cultural differences. For example, Indonesian, for instance, don't necessarily make decisions the same way as Australian do. Therefore, we need to recognize that the cultural background of a decision maker can significantly influence the selection of problems. Next, and then we have nudging. Nudging uses psychology to circumvent our natural negative tendencies. Next slide, please. And then we have organizational constraints. Organizations can constrain decision makers, creating deviation from their rational model. For instance, managers shape decisions to reflect the organization performance evaluation and reward system to comply with formal regulations and to meet organizationally imposed time constraints. So in organizational constraints, there is a performance evaluation system which usually managers are influenced by the criteria on which they are evaluated, and then reward systems. Actually, the organization and reward system influence decision makers by suggesting which choice have better personal payoffs. And then we have formal regulation. These formal regulation create rules and policies to program limit of decision choices. And then system imposed time constraint. All important decisions come with explicit deadlines like schedule and another deadline. So, and then the last part, we have historical precedents. Choices made today are largely a result of choices made over the years. Next slide, please. So, ethics in decision making. Ethical considerations should be important to all organization decision making. So there are three ethical decision criteria. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, there are three ethical decision criteria. So the first one, utilitarianism, or we can also call it as outcomes perspective. Actually, it's a system in which the decisions are made to provide the greatest good for the greatest number. And then the second criteria is making consistent decision with fundamental liberty and privileges as set forth in documents such as the U.S. Bill of Rights, or we can call it as rights perspective. In this criterion, protect whistleblowers when they reveal an organizational unethical practices to the press or government agencies using their right to free speech. And then the third one, we have imposing and enforcing rules fairly and impartially to ensure justice or an equitable distribution of benefits and costs. Or we can call it as justice perspective. Justice perspective are sometimes used to justify paying people the same wage for a given job regardless of performance difference and using seniority as the primary determinant in layoff decisions. Next slide, please. So we're gonna talk about corporate social responsibility roles. So in a public concern about individual rights and social justice suggests that managers should develop ethical standards based on no non-neutralitarian criteria. This is where the corporate social responsibility comes into effect a positive change. And now the CSR is beginning to make a good business sense and folding ethics into utilitarian computation. Next slide, please. So we have behavioral ethics. So in behavioral ethics, is basically analyze how people actually behave when confronted with ethical dilemmas. And research stated that while ethical standards exist collectively in societies and organizations, an individual in the form of personal ethics, we do not always follow ethical standards promoted by our organization and sometimes violate our own standards. And this is how to increase ethical decision making in programs. So basically, there's this story called Broken Windows Theory. The idea of the story is the idea that decayed and disorderly urban environments may facilitate criminal behavior because they signal antisocial for norms. In this Broken Windows Theory, in this how to increase ethical decision making in organization, there are actually three steps that we can follow. The first one is manager must first analyze that ethical behavior can be affected by signals. And second, managers should encourage conversation about moral issues. And then the third one, we should be aware of our own moral, or we can call it as blind spots. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about lying. Lying is one of the top unethical activities that we may indulge in daily, and it undermines all effort toward sound decision making. Lying is hard to detect, with over 200 studies indicate it can correctly identifying identify lying. 47% of them is lying of the time. So the techniques to detect lie, there are basically four techniques. The first one is eye contact, or basically police use this to detect lies that criminals do. And then this technique that most police the research this technique that police use is not substantiate the underlying theory. And then the person's body language research found that the probability of detecting lying based solely on body language was less than a random guess. And then the third one, facial expression. This lie detection technique is also not supported because there's not enough evidence. And then the fourth one is words, like repeated phrase and emphatic phrase in the email or in our chat. And to conclude this, lying is deadly to decision making, whether we sense the lies or not.
So now we go into the section of creativity, decision making, and innovation in organizations. So why do we need creativity in individual decision making? Uh, i- a decision maker needs to be supported with creativity, which is the ability to produce novel and useful ideas. It allows the individual to appraise and understand problems fully and seeing problems others can't see. Next slide, please. So in the three-stage model of creativity, there is the, divided into three: the causes of creative behavior process, and creative outcomes. It begins with causes of creative behavior begins with creative potential from the individual and the creative environment. And the creative behavior from the process usually begins with the problem formulation, which is the stage where creative behavior involves in identifying a problem or opportunity that needs to be solved. Information gathering, we gather the information and facts that you want to be solved. And the idea generation is the process of developing the solutions to that problem from relevant information and knowledge from the gathering of information. And the idea evaluation is the process of evaluating the idea and potential solutions to a problem and identifying the best one from it. Okay, in creative outcomes, there could be a novelty and usefulness of the outcome. Next slide, please. So, in the causes of creative behavior, there are two main causes: the creative potential, the creative environment. The creative potential is highly correlated with the individual, like intelligence. So the higher the intelligence the individual desire to learn is can be correlated with greater creativity from and personality. From the previous chapter, I think we discussed the openness to experience as a personality. So this correlates to creativity. And other personalities such as self-confidence, risk-taking, tolerance and ambiguity, perseverance and optimism can help people become more creative in their thinking. So other is expertise. Expertise is the potential. When you are good at something, more likely to be more finding the solution at what you're good at. So the last one is ethics. Uh, it is not correlated though, because ethics is sometimes, be broken by people who are creative than normal people. So we go on to the environment of the creativity. It begins with the motivation of the individual itself. How are individuals very much, how are individuals motivated to change something? And the rewards and recognition of work from the organization incentivize the individual to create something. And culture, this can be very different though, but there is a correlation in high score of individuality according to some research, but it does not necessarily mean that high score of individuality correlates with environment. It because many cultures are different. There is strong variation within cultures may also indicate creative behavior and good leadership. A leader needs to be someone that encourage development and discuss with other people in transparent fashion and you know and train their employees to do better. And diversity is one of the key elements, like when you have different people, different ideas coming together in one place, it inspires creativity. Next slide, please. So this is the last slide, I think. It is creative outcomes, the innovation itself. So ideas and solutions are judged to be novel and useful is usually judged by relevant stakeholders. So off-the-wall solutions are creative if only they solve the problem. These uses of these solutions might be self-evident and revolutionary. Others might be only considered successful by stakeholders initially and they fail in the long run. Uh, the factor that usually involves creativity outcome is usually soft skills. They will help translate ideas into results. So, and creative ideas do not implement by themselves, but rather from a social process that requires utilizing concepts including power, politics, leadership, and motivations from the individual itself. Okay, next slide.